Good afternoon, and I welcome you all to the second webinar of this series of Basic Research Methodology and Thesis Writing in Physiology, being organized by the Department of Physiology, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Jodhpur, along with the Physiological Society of India. I am Dr. Abhinav Dixit, and today I would be taking the webinar on ethics in research and publication. Continuing in the series of these webinars, yesterday we had a talk by Dr. Bharti Mehta on conceptualizing a research study. Now, once you have conceptualized the research study, it is important to take into consideration the ethical principles that govern every research. And for that matter, once the research is over, the principles of ethics that are important for publication. So once we begin this webinar, the first thing that I would like to discuss is what is ethics. We all, since our childhood, have been hearing about ethics, moral values. But what exactly are ethics? Now, ethics are different from moral principles. The principles that are for proper conduct. Now, the ethics as defined by WHO, the word has been taken from the Greek word ethos, and the word ethos means behavior. And therefore, this ethics word deals with the question of what is right versus what is wrong, what is good versus bad, and the situations where the conflict between these principles or values occur. Ethics over a period of time has evolved, and it is no more linked or specified to one particular field. Once we talk of the ethics in case of research, there's some other terms that come into play, one of them being the health ethics, some being the medical ethics, and the other being the bioethics. Health ethics basically represents the values that are underlying the basis of decisions and actions which are needed in healthcare, health research, and health policy. The medical ethics are concerned with the issues that arise in the case of the clinical context with respect to the specific patients, whereas bioethics is a broader field which is concerned with the maintenance of the health in all the living beings. Now, why is this issue of ethics so important in research? If we look back at history, we all know what happened in the Second World War and what were the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Once the war was over, the American Military Tribunal opened proceedings against German physicians and administrators, which was famous as the Nuremberg trial and which led to the formation of what is known as the Nuremberg Code. This Nuremberg Code of 10 principles was the first document, so as to say, which laid the background or the basis of research involving ethics. And this was the first document which said and advocated strongly the voluntary participation and the consent and the concept of the informed consent. Following this Nuremberg Code were a series of events that took place which further led to the evolution of the field of ethics. One of the major events that was there was the Tuskegee syphilis study. In this study, African American males, 400 of them were subjected to syphilis and they were not given treatment so as to see the natural course of disease. And this was a major ethical issue that came into the forefront. For all of those who are movie buffs, you can see the movie known as Miss Evers' Boys, which is based on this study. All these events led to the World Medical Association forming or establishing the recommendations to guide biomedical research, and this was known as the Declaration of Helsinki. And all the principles being laid down in ethical research today are basically a derivation, or the documents are evolved from this original Declaration of Helsinki. And what does this declaration of Helsinki state? It is stating that the research in humans has to be done only once we have solid data from lab and animal experimentation. The protocols that are there have to be reviewed by an independent committee, which now we all know as what is known as the ethics committee, which is institutional in most of the places. Another important thing that came into light from this declaration of Helsinki was that the informed consent of the participants is mandatory. We will be talking about this in detail later. The research can be done only by medically and scientifically qualified individuals. And another important thing that has to be done is that the outcome of the research, the risks should not exceed the benefits. Once we talk of the risk benefit ratio, the benefit from the research should be far more than the risks involved to the participants. In India, the guiding principle for the ethics is derived from what is known as the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants. This is a comprehensive document made by the Indian Council of Medical Research, last revised in 2017. And this is the guiding principle for all research and the ethics involved in research in India. Now, once we are talking of ethics in research, we need to know what are the key principles that play a role in this research. There are four main principles. First, and the most important, is do no harm. That is, in all circumstances of the research, the participant should not be harmed in any way. Another important principle is the autonomy of the participant. What do I mean by the autonomy? We'll talk of this later further. But it gives the participant the right to take a decision, an informed decision, so as to be a part of the study or to withdraw from the study. The third principle that governs the ethical principle is the beneficence, something that I just talked about, that the benefit from the study has to be much more than the risk involved. And the last principle, key principle, would be justice. Justice in respect to the study groups involved, the participants involved, the distribution of the study design, that is the results of the study, all of these need to be equally distributed. The key principle in all of this, governing all of this, is the concept of informed consent, which gives the individual the right to choose to participate or not to participate in a study, as well as the right to withdraw from a study without giving any reason whatsoever. The main thing in this informed consent, about which we'll talk in much more detail, is that all the information about the study design has to be disclosed to the participants, and it has to be ensured that the participant is able to understand the research methodology clearly. And if he's not, then all effort should be made to make him understand what exactly is being done in the study. Another important thing is, or rather the key thing would be, the participation is purely voluntary. There is no coercion or persuasion to participate in the study. The principles behind the ethical research is the principle of essentiality. What do I mean by when we talk of essentiality is that the study on humans should be undertaken only when all the other alternatives have either been ruled out or they have been considered and studies have been done on them. That is your animal models, or your, say, in today's times, you're talking of cell culture lines. All these available alternatives have been worked upon or they have been considered. Only then, as a final step to increase the advancement or to increase the knowledge, do we involve the humans. And we have to remember that whatever study we are doing, it has to be beneficial to the humans. As I earlier said, another principle is the principle of benefit and risk assessment. The research should bring about maximum benefit with minimum risk to the participants. The participants have to be told about the risks involved, and if it is known that the benefit is much more, only then do we take that study further. In today's times, when we are talking of data, whether it's related to our mobile phones or laptops or whatever form, the same principle of privacy and confidentiality also is encompassed once we talk of ethics in research. Privacy, which is nothing but it is the right of an individual to allow what information can be collected by whom and shared with whom. This is something we all know. Once we are installing apps on our mobile phones, we know that we have to give permissions to those apps. So this privacy in research is similar to that, that the individual who can only allow what information about him can be collected and it can be shared with whom. And the confidentiality is the obligation on the part of the researcher not to disclose any information regarding the participant. However, this confidentiality does have certain riders with it. There are situations, say court orders or on threat to a person's life, or when there is a public risk involved, wherein the data of those participants need to be shared. Otherwise, the principle of confidentiality is is of utmost importance when it comes to dealing with the participant data. Now, this privacy and confidentiality also has to be upheld when we are talking in terms of publication. I would share a common example that we all in our publications tend to put photographs of our participants. Now, these photographs need to have certain things in them so that the individual cannot be identified. And the easiest way we can do it is to put a black bar over the eyes so as to hide the identity of the individual. So whether it's while doing the research or while later on while publishing the data, we have to ensure that this principle of privacy and confidentiality is upheld. Another important thing, which is again derived from the Declaration of Helsinki, is that the research can only be done by a competent and a qualified person. And the person who is doing the research has to be fair, honest, impartial, and transparent in all the manners. He has to disclose his conflict of interest, and the record should be available to the legal and administrative authorities if they want to scrutinize the records. Another principle that underlines the ethics is the principle of distributive justice. In today's times, once we are talking of various issues that are coming to the foreplay, whether it is racial discrimination, gender bias, and all those things, once we are doing research, we have to rise above all of this and ensure that the benefit coming out of that research is distributed equitably among all the sections of the society, and it should not be confined to one group or one socioeconomic strata. Things that come into play while we are planning our research is the payment part. You may recruit subjects or volunteers for your study. You may want to undertake investigations for them. The question comes up, why should a normal person or even a person who's part of a study pay for extra investigations that are being done? So while planning the study, we all need to take care of this. The people who are the participants in our study, they may be traveling from faraway places. They may be not be able to go for their work on that particular day, and they might be a daily wager. So all these things need to be taken into consideration when we are planning the study. And ethics upholds that, yes, in situations like these, the expenses need to be reimbursed, or the investigator, while applying for the grant, needs to take these expenses into consideration and pay on behalf of the subject for these investigations and these travel and other inconveniences that are caused to the subjects. One of the most important things that comes to light while we are planning a study is a conflict of interest. What is conflict of interest? Conflict of interest is a situation wherein the person's judgment is affected because he is being unduly influenced by a secondary interest. Looks complicated? It is not that complicated. I'll simplify it further. Say I'm working on caffeine. I'm doing studies on caffeine, and my study is being sponsored by one of the major producers of a coffee or a major coffee brand. This is a conflict of interest. My sponsor for the study on the product I'm working on are the same. A coffee brand sponsoring my study on caffeine is a big conflict of interest. So obviously I need to take care of this, or I need to declare it. It's not that I cannot do this, I can do this, but after giving proper declarations and making my stand clear regarding this research once I'm filing with the Institute Ethics Committee. Another tendency that all of us have as faculty is, and even as residents, was that we generally tend to take our students as our subjects. Doing studies on normal physiology, I want to record a BP of say 200 individuals in the age group of 18 to 25. The best way people consider it is, okay, I can enroll students. I've got a batch of 100, a batch of 200. I can easily get those. But we need to remember this here, that these students are a vulnerable group. And what do I mean of them by this? They are incapable of protecting their interest. We as faculty, as the teachers, if we ask them to do something that creates an undue pressure on them, or it's undue persuasion on them to be a part of the study. Because why? They might think that yes, tomorrow some of us would be their examiners, we could affect their results, or we could harm their careers, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this group becomes a vulnerable group. I could do that same study in the individuals 18 to 25, but from a different college. Why is that we tend to use medical students of our institute as a subject always? No, we should not, because they are in such a position that yes, they can be persuaded. Some other groups that can be taken as vulnerable, prisoners, they're confined to a particular area, a particular building, they can be coerced to be a part of the research. We need to do research. If we want to do research on these people, we need to be very clear as to why we are choosing these individuals, what is different in these individuals as compared to other similar groups that might be existing, and only then we should plan the research on them. You want to do a study on pregnant females and it involves pregnancy, obviously pregnant females are a vulnerable group, but if there's a justification that yes, it can only be done on pregnant females, nobody's stopping you from doing the research. But the justification has to be very strong. Similarly, for doing research on medical students, the justification as to why medical students are a different cohort, why are we specifically choosing them, and why can't we do this study in another group of individuals, this has to be clearly addressed. Only then can these studies be allowed, or should be rather undertaken. Another important thing is to talk of the post-research access and benefit sharing. That is, once you've got your data, you've got something tangible out of it, you should disseminate that with the individuals, with the communities, and those populations from where your subjects were derived, so as to help them. And this brings us to the concept which is most important once we are doing any research, which is the concept of consent. What is consent? According to the Indian Contract Act, two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. As evident from my cartoon, the doctor is asking the patient if he's ready for the surgery, and the patient doesn't know what surgery he has to undertake. So obviously there's a lack of communication between the two, and the patient doesn't know, so he hasn't agreed upon that. And the basis of consent is that anybody who has a sound mind, is well oriented in time, place, and person, has the right to determine what can and what cannot be done to his body. This brings us to the types of consent. The first one being what is known as the implied consent. Implied consent, which is implied by a demeanor, by our action. A patient visiting a doctor in his OPD is sort of an implied consent. He's come there because he wants the doctor to examine him. So this is an implied consent. In contrast to express consent, which is either written or oral, given explicitly. Say for a minor surgical procedure, you want to undergo an IND, and you obviously have to give a consent that yes, you agree to the IND and the risks involved in that process. So this is express consent. Once we are talking of ethics in research, the most important thing is the informed consent. Why I'm using the word informed, I'll come to it later. The key thing in informed consent is that it is voluntary, it has to be written. And informed, why? Because everything about that study has to be told to the participant. And how do I tell it? I have to tell it in a language in which he can comprehend or understand, and he is able to make a judgment whether he wants to be a part of that study or does not want to be a part of that study. This decision of his has to be purely voluntary. It should not be under coercion or persuasion. And in case the participant says unconscious and we are doing a study on such patients, then the legally appointed representative of the person has to be taken and his consent has to be taken. Now, the key thing in this process is that the subject should be able to understand the entire study. And how can he understand if it is told to him in his own language? Here, our next door friendly doctor is telling everything about the study to the patient in English, but the patient does not know English. So, what does the doctor do? He needs to get somebody, or he himself needs to explain everything in the patient's own language, which in this case could be Hindi. Depending upon the regions where we are, this would change. But yes, key thing is that the subject should know what is being done and he should be able to understand what is being done. So both the roles of the researcher as well as the participant are important. The researcher has to communicate properly so that the participant is able to understand. Another important thing that comes into consent is the right to withdraw from the study. What do I mean from this? During the process of the informed consent, or during the process of the study, say 6 months down the line, you have a study which is for 3 years. The participant or the subject or the patient or the case or the control, so as to say, decides to withdraw from the study. He has the right to withdraw from the study without giving any reason whatsoever, and this does not deprive him or adversely affect his normal doctor-patient relationship and his normal treatments or the modalities that are being offered by the researcher or the doctor to that patient. So this research protocol is independent of his relationship with the doctor, where the doctor as a treating doctor has to give him all the proper care, whether he is a part of study or he is not a part of study. Therefore, it's basically the responsibility of the researcher in this entire process of informed consent to tell the participant that yes, what is being done, how it is being done, what are the risks involved, what are the benefits that can be expected. But he should not, during this course of disclosure, make false promises or give him assurances which are difficult to fulfill. The researcher has to respect the right of the individual to withdraw. The informed consent has to be documented. Each institute has an institutional ethics committee, and each ethics committee has a general template of a informed consent form, which has to be tailored according to the study that is being done. And at the end of it, if you look at it, there is a place where the subject or the participant has to sign. In case the participant is not able to sign, his thumb impression has to be taken. The researcher also has to sign along with the date in the presence of witnesses. Another important thing that has to be kept in mind is the consent has to be from the proper individual. In case we are doing studies on pediatric age group, the consent has to be taken from the parents. We also need to take care of the circumstances in which the consent is being taken. You want to do a study on school children, the school can give you the permission, but ultimately the consent to be a part of the study has to come from the parents of those children who are being enrolled for the study. It is not that if the school has given you the permission that you can carry out the study without involving the consent from the parents. So this is something that we all need to remember. So the consent form also has to be tailored according to the circumstances and the needs, wherein it has to be either a consent form or an assent form, wherein the parents would give the consent for the pediatric age group. Another important thing that we need to remember while we are doing this process of consent is that there are times when a reconsent or a fresh consent has to be taken. And when is this? As I said, we are doing on a pediatric age group. The person becomes an adult during the course of the study. The study was of 3 years. When the person enrolled, he was 16, 17, and he's become 18, and now you need to take his consent. Another thing, patient was unconscious. He regains consciousness and is now able to understand the implications. Earlier, his representative had given the consent, but now we need to take the consent from the patient. Long-term period where the study has to be extended. The subjects need to be told the reasons why it is being extended, and the consent needs to be taken. And also another important thing which happens many times while during course of a study is the change or the modification in the modality, procedure, visits, or data collection methods, or anything, any modification whatsoever in the protocol of the study warrants a reconsent or a fresh consent. Now, once we are planning our studies, once we planned it, we submit to our ethics committees, institutional, all the PGs would write a protocol. The protocol is then sent to the research review board and to the institutional ethics committee. And the institutional ethics committee looks into all these aspects that I've been talking about so far. They look into all of this, and yes, if there are issues regarding the ethics, those issues are addressed back to the student and the guide, and you need to bring about those corrections and resubmit to the ethics committee. Important thing to remember is the institutional ethics committees are not villains. They are there to protect the rights of the participants and ensure that the study meets the known ethical standards. And why is it needed to do all this? You just, after all, doing a study. Because once you have done your study, you've done your thesis, you would like to bring about a publication from it. Publication, why? Because publication is something that it is representing what you've done and telling the world what you've done. It is adding to the knowledge, and it forms the basis of new research. So the principles of ethics that were involved in designing that study are now needed or have to be represented in the proper format while the publication is being done. I will not go into the details of how publications are done because those will be taken up in a later webinar. I will be just now talking about these ethical principles being directed towards the principles or ethical principles in publishing. The key thing is that all publications need to be honest, clear, accurate, and complete. And once we have all these four things, we will have a nice publication coming out of the study. And how do we have these four? If we planned the study previously, keeping the scientific methodology intact and the ethical principles intact. Many journals these days, I'm especially talking of the PubMed Index journals, do tend to ask for ethical committee clearance certificates. So you need to plan your study properly so that it fulfills all the ethical guidelines. Now, what is the key principle behind the publication ethics? It is that your publication should be sound and it should be reliable. It should use the appropriate data analysis methods. And any publication, we'll come to the criteria for publication, is that it is the responsibility of all the authors. I'm making it clear once again, it's the responsibility of all the authors that particular publication. The results have to be reported without any fabrication or falsification. That is, there has to be honesty in giving your data. No matter you've got a negative study, that doesn't stop you from publishing. Sometimes negative studies are much more useful. One, they prevent the other people from, I would say, venturing into that field, which is now known after a series of publications not to give tangible results. And secondly, sometimes these negative studies pinpoint a flaw in the methodology which was being done for over many years, and other researchers are able to change those methodologies and bring better publications out of it. So your details of the experiments need to be very concrete. You should not be omitting your findings in the publication, even if it is a negative publication. And as a researcher, it's your obligation to inform the editor at any stage of you find any error in the publication. There's so many times we see journals taking out corrigendums, and that is fine. As long as you are being true and you are being ethically correct and you are reporting the results with honesty, any error can obviously be taken care of at an appropriate forum. The findings need to be balanced in terms of the contradictory and the findings in support. And while writing that publication, we should be able to justify our findings in view of both these, whether supportive work or contradictory work. Another ethical principle that is that the article should not be submitted to more than one journal at a time. And I think all of us know once we are submitting the article to any journal, they take a cover letter, and many journals do have a format where you need to tick that you haven't submitted this article to another journal, or this article is not under consideration in more than that particular journal. Also, while using the images, the important consideration has to be that we need to follow the copyright laws. We just cannot take any diagram, anything from anywhere and put in our publication without following the copyright laws. I will not be going into the copyright laws. That's a difficult different IPR issue altogether. So I will not be going into that right now. But yes, we need to follow those copyright laws, and we need to represent the data and images properly, whether it's in terms of the privacy of the individual or the confidentiality of the individual. All of these, as I talked earlier, putting a black bar over the eyes to protect the identity, not uh, putting the names of the individuals into the publication. We need to be very clear on this. This involves your publication of the thesis. While you're submitting the thesis, many universities do ask for the raw data to be attached. While doing that, please do not disclose the identity of the individuals, whether it's by the name, by their address, or any other thing which can help reveal their identity. All this needs to be taken care of. Another important thing is that all sources of funding need to be explicitly told, whether it's, no matter, as I said earlier, I'm doing a study on caffeine with the chief sponsor being the coffee brand. It doesn't stop me from publishing as long as my study was done in a scientifically sound way, ethically approved manner. But I need to be clear and I need to be explicit while publishing the data in any journal that yes, this is the conflict of interest. This is from where I've got the my funding, or this is the sponsor of the equipment, and all of these things need to be told. Also, important thing is to tell about your stake in particular company or particular group. I will not be going into details of this. We all know there was latest few articles talking about certain people being a part of certain research group and getting funding from somebody, or having shares in those financial interests in those companies. So all of these things need to be very explicit. The data involving the animals is totally a separate issue, so I will not be going to that. But yes, there are institutional ethics committees looking into animal research. So obviously, all the data linked to the animals have to be reported accordingly. What we are talking of today is basically the research involving humans. And once you've got all of this correct, you've done a nice study, you've done a beautiful thesis, you've done your MD, and now you want to write a publication out of it. Then comes one of the contentious issues, which is authorship. Why I'm saying contentious, we all know why it is contentious. So, but first of all, why is authorship so important? Why are people running here and there to be authors of papers? Most importantly, the responsibility and the credit that you get is from this publication that you've done. You've written your thesis, nobody knows about your thesis unless and until you publish it in a good journal, it is widely disseminated. Publications are, yes, as told yesterday also, they are a requirement of promotions at many places. So yes, people need to publish. But more importantly, from a scientific point of view, it helps you to evaluate your research. A better impact factor journal publication is much more valued, and it helps you to get more grants from external funding agencies if you have good publications, or publications good PubMed index journals. And obviously, all of this ultimately would translate into a better name and fame, which I think inherently every individual wants to achieve it. But then comes the question of who is an author. Does anybody become an author? My colleague who sits in my room and has a cup of tea, can he demand an authorship from me if he's not a part of that study? Just because we both share the same room and we have good personal terms? Once it comes to authorship, all these issues need to be put aside, and we need to determine authorship based on 4 criteria of ICMJE. And these 4 criteria are substantial contribution to the concept, acquisition, design, analysis, interpretation of the data. Along with this, the person should have been involved in drafting of the work. Sorry, excuse me. or he or she should have been involved in critically revising the work. The final approval of the version has to be done by all the authors. And most importantly, all authors are responsible for the work. Each author has to carry the burden of that research on his shoulders, irrespective of the fact whether you're a first author or the last author or the middle author or fourth, sixth, whatever. Each author is accountable for that work. And the most important thing is all the four criteria should be met. It is not or, if you look at these four, it is and. So anybody who has contributed in all these four domains can only be an author. Now, once we are submitting our article to a journal, it is many times it happens that somebody publishes it and another person says, no, I was also part of this study, but my name is not included in this study. It should also have been included. This is not the responsibility of the editor or the journal office. In case of any dispute, they would refer it back to your institution. An institution would then look at it as to how the study was done and so on and so forth. So ethically speaking, if you were to write a publication and you're a big research group that is working on something, it is better to decide at the very beginning of the study as to who will be the first author, who would be the corresponding author, and the sequence of names in those authorships and those publications. This helps us to remove the post-publication conflicts that do arise. Now, who does not qualify as the author? This is an important question. Logically speaking, the first would be anyone who does not fulfill all those four criteria. But besides this, there might be other categories of people who do not qualify as author. Those who are helping you to acquire funding. I have a friend who is well connected in external funding agencies and he is helping me. That doesn't make him author. Or somebody who's doing a general administrative support or supervising the group without actually actively contributing to that research. Just being a supervisor doesn't make that person a author. If you see, whatever we are talking of in terms of authorship is based on those criteria. Writing assistants, we do have so many companies that do this writing assistant job of technical editing, foolproofing and all those things. But those companies do not become the author. Those people in those companies do not become the author of that paper just because they're doing this work. So all these criteria for authorship are strict, the four that have been laid down, and have to be fulfilled by all the author. And if you look at the journals, many journals do ask the contribution of the authors in that study while you are filling up the names of the authors. Another important thing that comes in the unethical principles is something known as the gift authorship. Giving authorship to a person who has not contributed significantly. I would not like to go into the possible reasons, but yes, we all tend to want to have our publications in good PubMed index journals with a high visibility factor. So people do give name to their senior co-workers who are in a position of power, or people who are regularly publishing and who are experienced in the field, and they know that adding their name would increase the credibility of the research, or even to those with whom they work along so as to not to have a disharmony in their workplace. But why it is unethical is because by giving name to those individuals, we are actually sort of enhancing their expertise and passing a judgment of they're being competent when they actually haven't contributed to that, or they're not competent in that particular field. So the competence should just not be based on this. Rather, a person may be competent, but if he's not contributing to that study, he should not be given that authorship. Another important thing that is coming up in today's world is what the concept of ghost authorship. Ghost authorship is, there are people who do the entire writing of the paper, especially with the industry collaborations that we have, and these people are not given name in that publication. The publication, the authorship goes to a particular group of individuals or the research group. So this is ghost authorship. Somebody is doing the work on your behalf in the background, but is not taking the authorship. So this guest ghost syndrome is something we all know of, we all have seen it, we all have grown up with, but very frankly, it has to be based on the principles of ethics, whether it's the question of guest authorship, wherein we are adding the name of a reputed academic researcher who has no involvement, or whether it's the issue of ghost authorship, we need to avoid all these malpractices. Now, what are the author responsibilities once he or she is doing a publication? Again, coming back to the primary, which I said was the conflict of interest. The conflict of interest need not be financial. It could also be other than financial, where it could be personal rivalries or academic competition. And as a author, you need to be very clear and you need to declare all your conflict of interest. Another important thing is that, which many people do, is you tend to read a review article. You got some studies in those articles which you are not able to get from anywhere, those articles. And what you do is you tend to write down those conclusions from those studies without actually reading that study yourself. This is wrong. Why? Because that particular article cited an X article in a particular context. And by just using that line, we may not be able to justify the entire study, why it was done, what was its conclusion, or what was the hypothesis. And therefore, this tends to bring about a feeling of carelessness in writing of the paper. Another important tendency that many people have is the concept of self-citation. To increase your citation index, you tend to refer to your previous studies. All of these need to be avoided. We need to avoid studies selection based on particular culture, particular language, particular area. Yes, area, language do affect, especially when we are talking of genetic makeups of individuals. Only in those contexts it is appropriate. But why do it in general studies, which would have a broader base? You need to remember one thing, that any kind of an unethical behavior in publication can either lead to a retraction, or other people may point out to what is known as your mistakes in the letter to editor, or they may ask you to correct it. Another thing that comes into the publishing world is what we call as a redundant publication. You publish once and you use that work to publish again. You are using that same data, overlapping with some other parameter, and making more than one publication out of it. And it is done in such a way that the readers are unable to find the difference between that, okay, this was published earlier or not. So this is a redundant publication. The most important thing when it comes to publishing, whether it's, even if it's important for your thesis, is plagiarism. And what is plagiarism? As defined by the World Association of Medical Editors, WAME, it is use of others' published and unpublished ideas or words without attribution or permission, and presenting them as new and original rather than derived from an existing source. Looks complicated? No, I would simplify it further. It's basically using somebody else's work and putting those words as your own. That is plagiarism. Now, it could ideally be a plagiarism of text, which is nothing but you're copying verbatim from the source and putting it in your article without putting quotation marks. Or you could be taking the idea from one of these sources and without citing the original author and then putting it across as your own. There's something known as self-plagiarism. You use your previous work either in its entirety or portions of it while writing a new document. Now, important thing to remember is that plagiarism is not only unethical, it can also lead to punishments. And now most of the institutes do have plagiarism check software. There are plenty of them which are available. Those institutes who don't have, I would suggest you go online, Google plagiarism check software. You get many of those. There were different word limits. Put your study on those and see how much of it is plagiarized. Each journal has its own guidelines. Some say 1 sentence, some say 2 sentences, some say 2%, so on and so forth on plagiarism, and you need to take care of these while writing your publication. This is also important when you are doing your thesis. With newer websites coming where people have to deposit their thesis online, newer initiatives by the government also, this becomes even more important. So when you are publishing your thesis or publishing your paper, it is important that you do what is known as a plagiarism check. Another unethical principle that is there in reporting of publication, and that would be dealt with further once we are the other faculty members would be talking of data and its representation, is data falsification, which is nothing but trimming, cooking, and forging. The words meanings are clearly written. Trimming meaning altering your data, cooking meaning support selective reporting of your data, and forging making up data. Now, all these can be caught, and therefore these are totally unethical practices that are being done while reporting, while doing publications, and you need to avoid these. So to summarize all that I've been talking of in last about 40-45 minutes is that yes, we all need to publish, we all need to do our research, we all need to uh, do our MDs, NDMs, and LCHs and PhDs. But yes, whatever we do, or even post that as a faculty, we need to have grants, we need to publish. Whatever we do, whether it's the research or whether it's the publication, we have to ensure that we do it ethically. We follow the ethics principles that are laid down by the Declaration of Helsinki and the ICOMR documents in India, on which most of the institutional ethics committees run, and they have further framed their guidelines. And while doing the research, we follow those guidelines. And once we have the ethical clearance, we follow the journal guidelines in reporting that data and getting a good publication out of it. These are some of the resources that you can visit for further study materials that you would want regarding these topics. These are basically detailed topics, but I've broadly tried to cover those aspects that are needed as a postgraduate to plan your thesis, your protocol, and to convert your protocol into a successful thesis, and then convert that thesis successfully into a good, nice publication. With this, I would like to end. If there are any queries, suggestions, you are free to email me at this email ID or the ID that we would be showing just now. At the end, I would like to say that please do fill the feedback form. Also, for the postgraduates, there is a self-assessment link that is being shared. You may fill that up and have a nice time doing research. Do research that is ethically sound and publish it in a nice journal and enjoy. Thank you. Best of luck to all the postgraduates for their thesis and future. Bye-bye.